Okay, so on today's film, the Gemara, we're in the middle of discussing a sugya where Rav has said, Rav has said in the name of Rav, that Rav is of the position, Hamakdish Avdo Yatzol Cheres, that if you say, I'm consecrating my slave, really your intention was to say, I'm making him, I just want him to be part of an Am Kadosh, part of the holy nation, not that I really want him to be part of the temple, and therefore he goes free. So the Gemara challenges this from a brisa on the bottom of 38b, 2 lines from the bottom. Gemara says, the brisa says, Amakdish Avdo, if somebody consecrates their slave, Oseva Ochel, then the slave can continue to work, and the slave could continue to work either on your behalf or his own behalf, and he can continue to consume what he makes, and they're not prohibited to have benefit from it. Because what it means is, that it means that the only thing that was consecrated was of value. He didn't intend, he only intended to consecrate his value. Hold on 1 second. I have to stop the messages from coming in. That he only intended to consecrate the value of the slave, but not the actual slave. So that's the essence of what he was saying. So we see from here, it's not like Rav, because Rav says a makdish avdi goes free, but here we say that if you're makdish your slave, it means you intend to give his value to the temple. So it's not like Rav. So the Gemara says that Bryce on top of 39a, that Bryce is the position of Rabbi Meir. Amani Rabbi Meir, this is the position of Rabbi Meir, who says that if a person says something to hektish, he intends it to mean something. That he doesn't intend his words to be nothing for the temple. He intends to give something to the temple. And Rabbi Meir is based upon the Brisa and Erech, where it states, I'm reading from Rashi, that if you consecrate the value of somebody less than a month, Rabbi Meir says it must mean, since that person's Erech is not listening to Torah, it means you intend to give his value. And so therefore, since he knows that a slave can't be brought as a sacrifice, and so therefore must be, he intended to give his value. So therefore, that Brisa is consistent with Rabbi Meir. But Rav argues, and Rav says that the intent was to free the slave. And indeed, that's the logical position, that Brisa is the position of Rabbi Meir. To Katani Seifa, because the conclusion of that Brisa says, so the conclusion of the Brisa says, so too, a person who consecrates himself to the temple, he can continue to eat and to work, and he's allowed to get benefit from his own work because he only intended to consecrate his own value to the temple. Now, Iamris Bishlama Rabbi Meir, if you want to say that this is the position of Rabbi Meir Shapir, and then it makes sense. That what's the reason that he gives his value? It's because a person doesn't say anything in vain. And it's as though he said "damafalais," as though he intended to say, "I'm giving my value to the temple," and so therefore he has to give that value. A person knows that his body is not kodush. Aliyamris Rabbanan, but if you want to say it's the position of the Rabbanan, and their concern is, as look at Rashi, Aliyamris Rabbanan v'taima mishum demakdish stam davar shein royal gufo. And if you want to say it's the position of the rabbis who say if you consecrate something that's not able to be brought in the temple, then we say that your intent was for sacrificing to be sold. If you want to say it's the position of the Rabbanan, Bishlama Avdo, it makes sense that the slave can be sold. You give the value. Ihu with Mekai, he doesn't stand to be sold. So therefore, it has to be the position of Rabbi Meir. Look at Rashi. Bishlama be'eved. It makes sense by a slave. You could say stame l'damim kai, that you could say a slave is to be sold, and that's what he means when he says it's kadosh. It means to be sold. But the person himself, you can't say you're sold. A person who's free has no value to be sold, and so therefore it must be that this price is the position of Rabbi Meir. And it's because, even though his intent was not to say that I intend to be sold, but it's because we assume that the person wasn't saying anything for no reason, that a person is not motzi dvarav lebatala. And so therefore, since he's not motzi dvarav lebatala, therefore it must be that he intended to be sold. And so therefore, the slave, the treasurer doesn't really own the slave, he's just getting the money. So therefore, we're seeing that there's a dispute between Rabbi Meir and Rav, that Rabbi Meir is saying that if you say the slave is a makdish slave, if you consecrate your slave, it means that you take the value to the temple, whereas Rav says the slave goes free under those circumstances. So Gemara says, Lema ketanai. Let's say that this dispute of whether or not you're makdish your slave, are you giving the value to the temple, or are you saying that the slave basically goes free? Let's say that that's a dispute amongst the Tanaim. See, Rashi's language here is a little difficult for me to understand. Rashi says, Matish Avdo Kadosh Lo Kadosh. We actually didn't see a position that says he's Kadosh, but we're saying that the value is Kadosh. That's what we're saying, that Rabbi Meir is saying the value is Kadosh, not that the slave himself is Kadosh. So let's see from here. Machukas Tanayim. So what's the Machukas Tanayim? Makdish Avdo Emo and Bo. So let's say it's a Machukas Tanayim where you can actually consecrate your slave, because we say that if you consecrate the slave, then you're not allowed to Emo and Bo, meaning to say that there is no Me'ilah. That if you benefit from that slave, it's not like you're benefiting from temple property, because you can't possibly be Makdish your slave. Whereas Rashbag says Molim Besaro. Rashbag says that actually, if you benefit from his hair, it's considered to be like you're benefiting from the slave. What's the nature of this dispute between the Tanakama and Rashbag? What's the nature of this dispute? Isn't the dispute the Marisavar Kadosh that the Rashbag says the slave can become consecrated, Marisavar Lo Kadosh, whereas the Tanakama says he can't become consecrated. Gemara says, "V'tizbara, is this really logical? Hi molim and bo ve'emolim, but why would the brisa, if you can really be kadosh, why would the brisa use the language of you're doing the ilo or not? It should say hi kadosh ve'eno kadosh mi'balei. It should say whether or not it's consecrated straight out. So we wouldn't understand the language under those circumstances. Ella the kuli alma kadosh. So everybody says if you consecrate the slave, everybody in this brisa is in the position that you can. In here, Rashi is more explicit that there's something consecrated and you should take the slave and sell it for its money. Limachar or damav. Rashi says that explicit damav limachar, that you could take the value. Everybody says you could take the value and sell it. Everybody says under these circumstances that if the slave is consecrated, according to this price, that everybody's in the position that you could take the slave and sell it for its value. So the Gemara says, so what's the concern here? One is of the position, so one is of the position that the slave is like the real estate. And one is of the position that the slave is like the movable object. So if the slave would be like karka, like real estate, there wouldn't be any me'ilah, because there's no me'ilah, there's no misappropriation of real estate. It's only on movable objects. So the Gemara says, well, if that's the case, why do you have to say that they're arguing about hair? Why wouldn't you say that the argument is on the whole body? So the Gemara says, everybody says the slave is like real estate, and there wouldn't be any me'ilah. Here we're talking about the hair that's ready to be cut. So since the hair is ready to be cut, one views it as though it's already cut. And one says it's not like, we don't view it as like it's cut. If it's cut, it's like if it's not ready to be cut, then it's like real estate and there's no me'ilah. But if it's ready to be cut, then it's not like real estate and there would be me'ilah on the hair. Gemara says, "Lema hani tanai kahani tanai." Maybe this is the same dispute as we have elsewhere, like we learned in the Mishnah in Baba Mitzia. The Tanan, Rabbi Meir Omer Yesh Varm Shem Kikarka Ve'enan Kikarka. Rameir says that there are some things that. But by the way, the Rashi says that there's no me'ilah by karka. Where do we have this idea? So a me'ilah karka. Where do we know this? Because we learn how me'ilah for chait from truma. Just like truma has to be something removed from the ground, also me'ilah has to be something removed from the ground. So the Gemara says there are certain things that are like. So let's say it's like the same dispute by the Mishnah Bamitzia. The Rameir says there are certain things that are like karka. That means that they're always considered attached to the ground, but ve'enan karka. But they're also not like they're attached to the ground, because we have a principle that you don't take an oath about karka, but so about real estate. So what are we talking about here? Yesh varim she'enam karka, and there's some things that are not like karka. And so the Chachamim don't agree with him. What's the case we're talking about? Kate said, Etzer gefanim. Let's say a person has 10 grapevines. Etzer gefanim to unos masarti ucha. Let's say the person says, here are 10 grapevines that they're filled with grapes that I gave to you, meaning they're ready to be picked. V'hala omar einon el chamesh, and the other one denies that you gave him 10, you gave him 5. So if it would be real estate, you wouldn't take an oath on it. But if it wouldn't be real estate, it'd be modev and mixus, be a partial admission, and you take an oath. So Rameir says you take an oath. You must not view it as real estate. But the Chum say anything that's attached to the ground, we're going, even though it's going to be ready to be cut, we're going to view it. We're going to view it as still attached to the ground. So maybe that's the same dispute about the hair about it's ready to be cut. Rabbi Yossi Bar Chanina explains the difference between them is grapes that are ready to be cut, to be picked. Rabbi Meir says it's like they're already picked. The Rabbanan Savri Lav Kibitzuristam, and the Rabbanan say no, we're viewing it as attached to the ground, and we don't view them as harvested. So it's the same dispute. Gemara says no. I feel with Tamer Rabbi Meir. Even the Rabbi Meir who says that those grapes are not ready to be harvested. Those grapes are ready to be harvested. We view them as though they're cut. He won't agree with this principle over here. Ad Khan will come Rameir. Some Rameir says over there by the grapes, the kama the kaimen, because the more they stay on the vine, miklash klishe, they get worse. Avalacha by the hair. He doesn't view it as though it's cut, because kama the kai that the more the hair grows, the better it gets. You have more hair, it's more beautiful. So it's not the same dispute. Kisalek Rabbi Chia Bar Yosef, when Rabbi Chia Bar Yosef went from Babel to Eretz Yisrael, when he left from Babel to Eretz Yisrael, Amar Lahai Shemaita de Rav Kamei Rabbi Yochanan. He said this teaching of Rav that somebody who frees their slave, the slave automatically goes free, and he doesn't. He automatically goes free if somebody makes their slave ownerless. He said this teaching of Rav in front of Rabbi Yochanan. Amar Rav Hachi. So Rabbi Yochanan said this. Rashi says, but to me, in astonishment, did Rav really say this? And now the Talmud is going to ask, but doesn't Rabbi Yochanan himself say the same thing? Why was he so shocked that Rav said this? Doesn't Rabbi Yochanan say the same thing? He says he goes free. Rabbi Yochanan says the same thing. If you make your slave ownerless, he goes free and he needs a get of emancipation. So this is what Rabbi Yochanan said. He didn't say it in astonishment. He said, Amarav Kavasi. He said, Rav says just like me. The Ika di Amri, an alternative version of this story is Lo Simuye Kamei, that they didn't complete Rav's words completely in front of Rabbi Yochanan. But rather what happened was they didn't complete the words and say he needed a document. So he's and Amalei said, and he says, doesn't Rav say that you require a get of emancipation? Rabbi Yochanan Tamei, and Rabbi Yochanan is consistent with his logic. The Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Mafkir Avda Yatzel Cheres V'Tzarach Get Shecher. That even if you make the slave ownerless, he still requires a document of emancipation. So the Gemara is going to analyze this statement now. If you free your slave, he goes free, but get shipper. He needs a document of emancipation. So Rabbi Abba challenges the statement of Ula. Let's say you have a convert who dies, and the reason why I'm talking about a convert is there's no relatives, because a convert he's considered to be cut off from inheritance-wise from the rest of his family. So if the convert dies, and the Jews come to plunder his possessions, And they had amongst them slaves, being Gedol and being Gitanim, adults and minors. So Kanu Atzman b'nei Chorin. So the slaves acquire their own freedom because they immediately, once the owner dies, they grab a hold of themselves and they're free. So whereas Abba Shaul says Gedolim Kanu Atzman b'nei Chorin Kitanim, but the minors can't acquire themselves; they don't have agency. So immediately, Kitanim Kol Machzak Bahen Zacha Bahen. Immediately, whoever grabs the minor, it's as though he's acquired him. And the Gemara asks the question now: who writes the document of emancipation? According to Rabbi Yochanan, he needs a document of emancipation. So how could somebody acquire them? They don't have anybody writing it. Their owner has died. So how could they acquire them? So Amar. So this was the question that Rabbi Abba asked to Ula. So Ula responded, "Dami haimi d'Rabbanan k'delo give me inchi shvaita." He says this rabbi who asked this question, i.e. Rabbi Abba, he seems to me like someone who doesn't know what he's talking about. It's like he's never learned the teaching in his life. My Amar Ravna, my Amar, the time of my. What's the reason why he said that Ula says this question of Rabbi Abba is not a strong question from this brisa? So the Gemara, so that's not because they're trying to say, listen, they don't need to get shikra. He says this is not a strong question. Why? Amar Rav Nachman Kasavar Ula Abdul Deger Ki Ishto. He says the slave of a convert is like his wife. My Ishto Mishtalcha will get just like his wife. If when the slave when a person dies, or when a convert dies, his wife is divorced without a get. He says in this circumstance where the convert dies, the slave is sent forward without a get. It's like the wife when she dies. The Gemara says, well, if that's the case, if that's the case, also when a regular Israelite dies, they shouldn't be they shouldn't require a document of emancipation. Amar Krasser says, no, about that there's a verse. You should bequeath them to your children afterwards as an inheritance. So the Gemara says, well, if that's the case, well, let's say you made your slave ownerless and then you die, so it's not bequeathed to the next generation. And under those circumstances, he's not being inherited to his children. Who mace, he shouldn't require a get shichror to take away the prohibition because he's dead. So the Gemara says, if that's the case, why does a maimer say mafkar abdu v'meis also evid in lo takana? But why does a maimer say that slave, he can't get shikhr, he has no solution to be able to get married, because since he was released him from his ownership, he has no ability to bequeath him to his children, and still he requires the get shikhr. So we have nobody to release him with the get. So Gemara says, indeed, a maimer is kasha. A maimer is difficult because according to this approach, a maimer is difficult because the reason why he can't, the only one who could release him, we were talking about before, was according to this approach, we had said earlier that the ger is the one whose slave is sent away without a get. But here we have a contradiction, because the brisa says that the brisa says that they can acquire him, but according to a maimer, he has no takana. So we have a challenge on a maimer from this brisa. Amar Yaakov Bar Idi, Amar B'Shimon Levi, Halacha ka'Abba Shaul. He says the law is like Abba Shaul, who says that whoever grabs a hold of these Kitanim slaves is going to get them first. So so therefore, that's what Abba Shaul says. I'm like Rabbi Zero, Rabbi Yaakov Bar Idi, on top of Ramates Amabeis, he said to him, the Pirush Mi'alach, O Mekolosh Mi'alach, this teaching of Abba Shaul that you said, that you heard from Rabbi Shimon Levi, that was like Abba Shaul. Did you hear this explicitly, or did you derive it from a general principle? My call. What's the general principle that you might have heard that halachas like Abba Shaul? The Amar B'Shul and Levi, Amar Lefnei Rebbe, that they said in front of Rebbe, Amar Nisyashti Miponi Avdi, that if a person said, I've given up hope on my slave such and so, meaning to say, Rashi says it's a lesson of hefker, he declared him ownerless, what would be the law? Amar Lahem, Omer Ani Elo Takana. Rebbe says there's no solution, Ela Bishtar. The only solution, the only way you can marry a Jew is if he gets a contract. Gamar Rabbi Yochanan, my time at the Rebbe. Gamar la Isha. Ma Isha Bishtar af Emed Nami Bishtar. He says we learned it out from a woman. Just like a woman requires a bill of divorce, so too a slave requires a bill of divorce. The Kadiyata Mina, and since Rebbe learned it out, looking at Rashi, Kivin the Rebbe Meisha Yalef, since Rebbe learns it out for a case of a woman, it must be that Rebbe's only referring to a case where he's mafkir eved gadol, where he's making an adult slave ownerless, and so therefore he has an ability to acquire himself, and so therefore once he made him ownerless, he only has a prohibition of marrying him, but not any in-law of Ela Isur of a low mammon. He only has this prohibition, but not the money, and that's like a woman that when she gets a get, it's not coming to take away money from her, but it's not coming to remove her from any monetary responsibility from a prohibition responsibility. But by a minor of the Evet Katan, Rebbe was not referring to that because it's not similar to the woman, because the assumption is that he has the assumption is different there in the case of a minor. The assumption is that there is some monetary claim on the minor. And so therefore the minor slave, since he didn't acquire himself, he would be able to be with the slave. So by the adult, we're going to say he needs the star shepherd. And so Rebbe is saying this by the adult. The adult, he needs the star shepherd. But what did Abba Shaul say? Abba Shaul had said the ketanim call machzik b'hamzacha because the minor can acquire himself, and this is consistent with following the general principle that Rebbe has established. So the Gemara says. So the Gemara now asks the question. So Rav Yaakov Bar Idi asks Rav Zera, he says, from your words, it's possible to understand that it's difficult to infer from Rebbe that the law is like Abba Shaul. Because if that would not be the case, why would you say, did you hear it explicit or was it a general principle? And so therefore, what's the difficulty? Amrullah, so Rabbi Zera says, because I was saying, if you learned it out from Rebbe, you didn't learn it out correctly. Adarabah, just the opposite. So you could have taken that same teaching from Rebbe and learned it the other way. You could have said, Ma'isha ben gedola ben katana. Just like a woman could be divorced with a get, she's divorced whether she's an adult or a minor. Avename ben gadol ben katan. So to a slave, it needs to be released whether he's an adult or is a minor. And so therefore, also the death of the master, as learned out from the death of the husband, she should be will free the minor, just like the Chum, not like Abba Shaul. So Yaakov Bar Idi said, "Beferish Mili." I didn't hear it as a klal. I didn't hear it as a general principle. I heard it explicitly. So the Gemara now brings a different version. Reb Chiya bar Abba says, in the name of Yochanan, "Ein halacha ba'Abba Shaul." The law is not like Abba Shaul, but the law is like the Chachamim who said that the minors immediately do acquire themselves. Bar Abba says in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, but the law is like the minors that if their master dies, they immediately become free. So Amalei Rabbi Zera Bar Abba, but Ferish Mialoch, did you hear this explicitly that the law is like the Chachamim or Miklala, or did you learn that from a general principle? So he says, "My call. What's the general principle? The Amar B'Shua ben Levi, Amar Lifnei Rebbe, Nisyashim report. It's the same price, and we're going to see how he learns it out the exact opposite way." They said in front of Rebbe Nisyashim Poni Avdi. He says, "I make my slave onerous. What will be the law?" Mahu Amar Lem Omer Ani Elo Takana Ala B'Shtar. He says in that case, you need to give the slave a document in order for him to marry a woman. My time with the Rebbe. Why does he say you need a document? Just like a woman is with a contract, also the slave is with a contract. Because and we learn out from there that the slave is like a woman. Also, a minor slave requires a get shechor. So therefore, so the Gemara says, what was your concern about it being learned out from a general principle? Adarabah, because you can learn out the opposite. You can learn out the opposite. Ma'isha asura, isura v'lo. Just like a woman, what's the concern? Just like by a star shikhr of just like by a woman, the get only removes her prohibition, but not any monetary obligations. Afavanami isura v'lo memona. So too by the slave, it only removes his prohibition, but not his money. And so therefore, it's the exact opposite. So the Gemara, you could learn out the opposite. So I'm a little bit fair, Shmeli. He says, indeed, I heard it explicitly, not the general rule. Amar Mar. So now let's analyze this statement where Rebbe said, if a person wants to make a slave onerous, Amar Mar, Omar ani ein lo takana ela b'shtar. And Rebbe says that such a slave, if you declare him onerous, he requires a contract. V'hatanya, is this really the case that the Evan needs a shtar shechor? V'hatanya, Rabbi Omer ani afu no sein dmei atzmo. But Rabbi says, under these circumstances, we learned in the Brisa, by the case of somebody who consecrates all his possessions, and amongst them were some slaves. According to the Tanakama, the treasurer is not able to free them. He can only sell them to other people. Whereas Rabbi says, I say the slave himself can give money to the treasurer. No saying to me, gives him money and then he goes free because it's like the treasurer selling him back. And anyway, we see from here that a slave can go free even just by giving money without a shtar shopper. So Gemara says, this is what Rabbi said. He says, no, he needs freedom either by money or by a contract. But this slave, he was released from this monetary connection, and so therefore he can only use a contract. Rabbi's position is coming to exclude the following position, because we learned in the Brisa at the time, Rabbi Shimon, Omer, Mishim, Rabbi Kiva, Yachol, Yeh, Kesef, Gomer, Ba. I might think that money can release a shifcha kananis, a Canaanite woman slave, to allow her to get married. Kederach shashtar gomer, but just like a contract does. Talmud Omer, va'aftei lo niftasa. So meaning to say that she needs a shtar shechur. And the parsha completes. The whole parsha is coming to teach us that she needs a contract and not money. And Amar Rabbi Chama Rav Nachman halacha Rabbi Shimon. The law is like Rabbi Shimon that the Canaanite slave does not go free with money. Rabbi Yosef Bar Chama says the law is not like Rabbi Shimon. So now we say Ashka Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak Rav Bar Sheilta Davikaya Pitcha Debeit Tefillah. So Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak found Rav Bar Sheilta that he was standing at the entrance of the synagogue. Amar Lei halacha oein halacha. He says, is the law like Rabbi Shimon that the slave needs a contract or not? Amar Lei, Ani Omer ein halacha. V'Rabbanan da'asu min Mechuza. I say that the law is not like Rabbi Shimon, but the rabbis who came from Mechuza, they say, Amar Rabbi Zer Mishmei de Rav Nachman halacha. V'chi asai l'sura. When I came to Surah, Ashkel Rabbi Chiya bar Abba Amar Lei Emily easy gufa de'uvda. He says, tell me what's the circumstance, what was going on. And Amrli, the case was Ahima Rasa, there was a maidservant of a Marash that her master was sick. Asya Bachya Kamesh. She came and she cried in front of him. And she said, Amrli, so she says, how long am I going to be enslaved for? Shakal Kume, the master took his hat. Shadabe, he threw it to her. Amala zil kaniha, acquire this hat, ukanina sheikh, and acquire your soul. Also, a kamed Rav Nachman. So then they came from Rav Nachman. And Amaru also kum. He said he didn't do anything. So some people who saw this incident and saw Rav Nachman's psak, they thought he didn't do anything because the law is like Rabbi Shimon that he can't go free with just money. He needs a contract. Veloi elamishum da'avile kelev shamachne. The whole reason was because it wasn't a proper kinyan with the money, because it was the man's possession who threw it, and that to have been her possession, and so therefore it was insufficient. So, okay, we'll stop here. God willing, we'll do this again on Shabbos, and we'll do it even better. Yasher koach to everybody, and a good Shabbos.